this definition, an apiary husbandry. And I call it that in this regard to really bring home the fact that we are raising livestock. So whether they are bees or animals, sheep, goats, pigs, cows, chickens, whatever it may be, I do believe there's a correlation between the different definitions. So in my research to find a good definition of animal husbandry, there are a number of different ways to describe it. Everybody will have their own perspective, but I really appreciate the Livestock Conservancy's definition. And I'll just read that here. So the book, and I got this from the book that I'm actually using for my educational purposes, explains that the strategies that help ensure survival of breeds of livestock and dogs. Success in maintaining breeds is difficult to measure, while failure is easy to recognize by failing numbers of animals within a breed or by outright breed extinction. Lasting success for breed management involves much more than breed numbers and is based on a firm grasp of the biological aspects of breeds. Now, I think that we can see this in the colony collapse or the voraciousness of many of the viruses and bacterial issues that we see in bees these days. We'll get a little bit more into the history of those things maybe later today. If not, I'll discuss it in another podcast. Oh, excuse me. So, I wanted to share one of my favorite little sayings that you hear in the British quite often, and I think that it is very applicable to animal husbandry, beekeeping, and that is the idea of duty of care. We have a responsibility to our animals and our livestock, including bees, our plants, our pastures, as we do to our friends and our neighbors and our family. So I think if we can bear this idea in mind, we can make some better decisions for all of our livestock. Okay, so the biome is a collection of flora and fauna, microbes, archaea, fungi, etc. I am a biome, you are a biome, your dog is a biome, and an elephant is a biome, the soil is a biome. And this is a term that's being used a lot more these days, and I don't know if everybody necessarily has an understanding of what it means or how applicable it is to everything that we do. So we'll talk a little bit about that microbiome and macrobiomes as we go through. I may not call them out exactly, but we will discuss them. So in the bee, we have a number of components that contribute to the bee's biome, and that would include the physical body itself. So in addition to the body, it's all of the things that they do with that body, and that is collecting and storing nectar, or collecting pollen and storing nectar, creating propolis and wax, and that includes parasites. So anything that they're picking up out there in their external biome, flowers, trees, forages, grass, etc., is considered, I would think, a part of their biome. They are bringing it back into the hive, so it becomes part of their internal biome as well as their external biome. Nutrients that are collected from the flowers and the plants, and other things that they pick up along the way. So we will include fungi, archaea, virus, bacteria, etc., in the physical as well as in the microbial, and it actually affects their genomic aspects of the biome as well. So as far as the physical biome, we will also include the idea that the swarm itself, the hive, the space where they live, and the comb that they create is part of that environment. So in regards to their physical, interior and exterior, we also want to consider all the microbiology that lives and exists within and without. So again, we're going to discuss viruses, bacteria, fungi, archaea, yeast, parasites, and xenobiotics. Xenobiotics are a function of the biology of the bee, which allows them to process and eliminate pesticides or some other foreign agent, including viruses or parasites that come into their environment. So those abilities for those bees to process and deal with them. And if it becomes overwhelming, any aspect of a biological entity, including a bee, will be overwhelmed. And we can discuss that further as we go along too. So processes that occur within the bee, including the process of enzymes, antioxidants, antimicrobial proteins, et cetera, and their cellular, chemical, and hormonal effects. So this is all of the interior genetically, not modified, but genetically designed evolutionary kind of aspects of a species, an insect or human or an animal, a dog, an elephant, or whatever it may be. This also is applicable to plants. So we are all super similar. I mean, I think it's something that we really need to talk about. We sometimes compartmentalize different things in our life and our environments, but we all have a very similar function in that we take things in, we process them, and we release them. And if we don't release them and it becomes overwhelming, it can affect our overall immunity and health. So, okay. In that kind of level of conversation, we're gonna skip over to an analogy. So I came up with this cute little graphic, but my daughter is building me one that I hope to include into the next conversation. So I'd like to discuss this: a mouse, a bear, and a beehive. Okay. So if a mouse were to invade a hive, right, then the hive goes into mode, right? They're like, okay, we've got an invader. Assets are reallocated from their regular duties to protect the queen, or to protect the brood, or to defend the hive against the mouse. And in some cases, if the mouse were to die, they're going to react in a way to preserve, or to mummify that mouse or that external potential pathogen carrying entity. They're going to mummify it to prevent possible pathogens or fungus or anything that you don't want growing in your hive. They're going to try and eliminate that, and they're going to use propolis to do that. So that's just a little story. So we're going to talk to the next story, and that's a bear. So if you have a bear coming into the hive, right, those allocation of resources, they're not going to be as capable of defending the hive against a bear as they might be against a mouse. I mean, they're not going to have a lot of success maybe fighting off a mouse, but they're definitely not going to fight off a bear. So those allocation of resources, again, trying to protect the queen, trying to protect the brood, trying to defend the whole of the hive, the whole of the colony from this bear. And those resources are going to make them more susceptible or open up, vulnerabilities like with the mouse. But again, with the bear, it's going to be less successful. So let's take that analogy of this big thing that we can see and consider symbiotic archaea, bacteria, virus, and other living microbes. Okay, so we talked a little bit already about how the biome exists, right? We have all these different components, but in reality, it's all a balance of these different mechanisms, living and non-living microbial beings. I guess we call them beings, archaea, bacteria, virus, etc. they all work together. Not all viruses are bad. Not all viruses will destroy a creature, just like a cold sore, right? You can carry a cold sore, it's not going to kill you, right? So viruses can live within a colony or within a bee and not kill the bee. It can learn to develop some natural immunity to it and maybe pass those genes on to their subsequent, members of the community. But what happens when, so as we can see here, we have a bee that's surviving quite nicely. It's very healthy. You can see quite a few of these bees are just fine. But right next to it in the same colony, we have a bee that is suffering from a, deformed wing virus. Well, why aren't the other bees succumbing to this virus? Why is this particular bee succumbing to the virus? Obviously, its immune system and its personal individual biome doesn't have what it needs to manage or defend itself against that virus, and so it has succumbed, right? But these other bees, as we can see right next to them, are healthy and fine. So if a virus is not disrupting all of the bees, do we necessarily need to treat all of the bees, right? Let's just think about that for a minute. Okay. And as we go through, I have made little annotations down here where I'm finding these resources. I'm also leaving links at the end of this presentation, and it will also include them in wherever this is posted to. So you can go and do your own research, which I highly encourage. But I wanted to thank the Western Sydney educational platform that I received this from for their opportunity to use the picture. Okay, this series of pictures came from the Ask Biologists at asu.edu. I really appreciate this graphic. If you go to the site and check it out, it's got a very nice little informational about all the different components of the bee. I, one of these days, might do myself a little study card to get better at understanding all the different parts, but I have not done that. So at this point, we're just going to appreciate the different graphics and take a little moment to identify, the external parts of the bee, the different mechanisms that the bees use to create wax and manage propolis, pollen, and nectar, and then the internal components of the bee, which is more complex than I expected it to be, but also very interesting. I will point out this red here, item 12, which is their humoral system, which is their, you can liken that to blood in mammals. So, in my research to understand a little bit more about the immune system of bees, I came to understand that bees have a simpler, a more simple immune system, and is called an innate immune system versus an adaptive immune system. So mammals will have an innate and adaptive, and bees in particular, most insects I believe, have an innate I'll say that 3 times fast, immune system. So from this wonderful, wonderful paper called The Fundaments of Honeybee Immune System, and it seems to be authored by Alejandro Larson from the University, I'm going to get in trouble if I pronounce this because I don't speak Spanish well, but it is based, or Portuguese either, from Argentina. So I will leave a link in here if you guys check this out. It's a fantastic article. And it really digs deep into a lot of the different components and how they function within the immune system of the bee. But I wanted to call out the innate immune system. So, while insects have the innate immune system as their sole line of defense, rather than having the again, adaptive and innate systems, which higher vertebrates have both. So an innate immunity responds to exposure of pathogens or toxic substances, which with acquired mechanisms such as physical barriers and cells and chemicals that neutralize toxins and pathogens. He goes into a little bit more information here. And then innate immune system specifically is in part inherited. So we need to really think about that. So if their innate immune system is largely inherited, we need to be considerate of that when we consider our hive as a whole. And we can talk more about that in some other conversations throughout the winter. Resulting in a coevolution of individual immune systems with a myriad pathogens. So what that means to us is that not only does the bee, evolve, but it evolves in conjunction with viruses and pathogens and bacteria. And when we compromise that evolution by interfering with it with chemicals and other activities, we could also be compromising that evolution within the bee, right? So they may not become resistant to, or maybe become less resistant to pathogens and bacteria, et cetera, that they've been exposed to for a long time because we have interfered with that coevolution. All right, one more note on this. Innate immunity involves encoding those recognition receptors directly into the germline, which is then inherited by offspring. In this sense, the repository or receptors identified in studies species is limited and precocious. Again, this is saying that that coevolution is so vital to the bee's ability to manage and to cope with viruses and bacteria, et cetera, parasites that it has co-evolved with. So if we're interfering with that, we are compromising that bee, which may then eventually compromise its ability to pass that genetic information onto its offspring. So we really need to think about that when we're considering management, part of our duty of care, our beekeeping practices and husbandry of bees. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the immunity of bees individually. And in that regard, bees are very unique in that they only carry a third of the immune genes of a fruit fly or mosquito. The reason why we know this is because fruit flies and mosquitoes and bees are highly studied. I mean, apparently there are just numerous studies on these that they're very obviously acceptable. We can find them, accessible. We can find them readily, and we can cultivate them. And we have a lot of information on this aspect of those three insects. And we'll talk a little bit about why it might be the case that bees don't need to have as many genes individually, because we're going to talk about the beehive immunity, right? So before I get too deep into this, I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Leo for hosting this wonderful course that I went to. I have been researching for quite some time now bees. Actually, since 2015, I've been learning a little bit here and there, and then became very involved in bees. Let's see, 2 years ago. I didn't have a set of bees my first year. Wasn't planning on it, and then I was gifted some beehives, and so I ended up taking on bees my first year, and I lost both the hives. Partially, I think because I didn't understand the bees very well, and also because I refused to use some of the treatments that are prescribed by traditional Lancashire style beekeeping. It didn't fit with my ethics, and so I really just didn't want to compromise the bees by introducing artificial treatments or food, things along those lines. So I wanted to understand more, and Dr. Leo really kind of put all those puzzle pieces together for me. And I really want to say thank you to that. Thank you to him, and thank you for that experience. Okay. So, very interesting. Bees have this ability to create a social fever. So like when you get a fever, or I get a fever, or a child gets a fever, we can burn, basically, we can create our body heat, increase our body heat in an effort to eliminate a pathogen or a bacteria. It's tried and true, Mother Nature, you know. Sometimes you just gotta let that fever run its course. And so bees can do this as well. As you can imagine, heating a hive to that temperature can also endanger the bees themselves, and is very costly as far as energy use of resources goes. You know, you're bound to pull energy away from the bees in order to facilitate this heating. Grooming. Grooming is an individual activity as well as a group activity. I think it's Dr. Thomas Seeley, Professor Thomas Seeley for sure. He's got quite a few articles, and I just finished his book, The Democracy of Bees. Phenomenal book. If you don't know what the waggle band says, you've got to listen to it. I found this wonderful article anyways about grooming, and it is apparently, apparently, bees will communicate to their co-inhabitants, to other workers and other bees, that, hey, I need some help. My back, I got a little spot on the back here. Will you scratch it for me? And so they will do this little dance and get some assistance from their buddies. Okay. So really important to understand about this particular aspect of beehives is that this is another one of those genetic factors that is inherited. So you will get colonies that do not have a lot of grooming dancing going on, and you'll have colonies that do. So another group activity is the hygienic behavior. So beyond grooming, we have the ability for a set of bees to identify a pathogen or a bacteria in a brood and say, this one's bad, we got to get rid of it. And we can see that right here. See these little arrows, these punctures? Well, they have identified there's a problem with that cell, and they are opening it up, right, to not only kill the pathogen, but to kill its food source, which is the larvae or pupae. They will eventually also remove this debris created by the death of that pupae from the hive. They will evacuate it. So this particular instinct or genetic education is maternal. So if you have a good queen and she has good brood doing this, or good workers carrying on this activity, that's a good indication that she's got a genetic a hygienic behavior trait that she will pass down to her subsequent lineage. Okay, so you might not think about it, but part of the immune system of the bee in the hive also includes propolis. Propolis is a material that is collected from largely coniferous plants, trees. They bring it into the hive, and they use it to seal. They use it to, as I spoke about earlier, to mummify invasive animals or bugs that might come in to prevent pathogen growth. They use it to coat the interior of the brood cells. If you can imagine how sanitary a brood cell needs to be, this is a phenomenal tool for them to use to create a sanitary and probiotic, right, space for those little larvae to grow up in. Also, super interesting is that propolis, certain kinds of propolis, don't ask me which kind, go out and do your research and then let me know, because I haven't gotten there yet. If I do get into it, I'll do a video on it. So certain kinds of propolis can stimulate the genes of the bee immune system. And if you think about it, a lot of people use propolis for their own medicinal purposes. And we can see this. I found this little 19 proven ways. I haven't researched any of this, so don't quote me on it, but I found it really interesting, and it could be a great jumping off point for some research. I couldn't find the, it seems to be like a collection of information from a paper that was written. I've got links in the conversation at the end as to where to find that conversation, but this seems to be a nice little graphic about what happened in that paper. So, and then here we have a little image that I took from a picture. Got a little propolis building up there. So, propolis, good stuff. Finally, some additional behaviors and traits that are passed on. I didn't find any definitions for whether this is a maternal or paternal trait, but I would imagine that this is also a inherited behavior. And that is the self-removal from the colony. But we see this in most species of animals. If they are sick, ailing, probably likely to die, they will remove themselves from everyone else and go off and die in peace. Now, you might think that it's because they don't feel good or whatnot, but it also may be a mechanism to prevent growth of pathogens or rotting within the living space of everybody else. And, go back here. So cannibalism, we don't like to think about it, but this is something that happens in nature. When the resources are lacking, so you have a drought, the volume of pollen, nectar is limited because of maybe there was a terrible storm, it came through and destroyed a bunch of things, compromised the local resources, or a drought, right? So those resources will become scarce, and a beehive will limit the brood. They will cannibalize it. I'm not sure if that's the correct term to use, but they will use that hygienic behavior to remove them from the vicinity to prevent the use of resources for those care and maintenance of brood. So these social measures reduce the number of genes a bee needs to carry for an individual immunity. And I think that sums it up. So if we have a species like a bee that only carries a third of its genetic genes for individual care, do you think that it makes sense that 2/3 of those resources are coming from a community? I think it makes perfect sense, honestly. So that cuts down on the amount of material, genetic material, and other resources the individual bee has to put into its self-care, I guess. So I found this wonderful graphic. It is all over the place. And when I tried to find the original creator of this, I couldn't find a proper working website, but I found a website that gave credit to a westernbeekeepers.com. This site is not working right now. I don't know why, but I found it interesting that this wonderful graphic was found at the howtogetridofbees.com. So definitely going to have a different opinion about bees with this group. So thank you for the graphic to whomever created it. It is a lovely graphic. It's very short, very sweet. The different, day 1 to development, the worker bee taking care of the larvae, and then the pupae, and then the evacuation of that cell with the brand new bee, and then it goes to work, and then it becomes a nurse, and it's building comb, or it's guarding the hive, and then becoming a forager. So foraging seems to be a activity delegated to senior, more experienced bees, and some of those senior, more experienced bees have a important role in hive relocation. So when they go to swarm, those bees have a role to play in that as well. If you haven't heard much about this, again, I recommend the Democracy Bees. Very informative as to how swarms work and why they work the way that they do, based on a lot of the research available to Mr. Tom Seeley. our Professor Tom Seeley. Anywho, so let's talk about some of the things that can affect the bees. So we have at least 20 different viruses studied, or we were very aware of over the last 50 years. That doesn't mean that we didn't have viruses in bees before or bacterial problems in bees before, because we did. I have found some wonderful articles dating back to the 1920s and earlier discussing some of the problems that our beekeepers are having in their hives. So, class break. Okay, so some of the more common ones that we're all aware of are the American and the European foul broods, the deformed wing virus, very visible, easy to talk about. Some of the more obscure viruses that you may not have heard of are the sac brood, chronic bee paralysis. You may or may not be aware of this one. I think that there was some confusion at some point with this virus and chronic colony collapse, or colony collapse disorder, which we are not discussing in this particular episode here. I will leave the links as to where I found this information, but you can Google search any of this and find loads of information. Interesting. We know about the Varroa mite, right? But do you know about the parasites Nosema apis and Nosema carinate? I didn't either. So it's on my research list. I will do some more research on this, but it appears to be very much an internal parasite affecting some systems within the bee. And these things, when they are compounded, I mean, you have a hive that has more than one factor here. These little parasites can be a huge factor in how well your bees are coping with other, maybe less aggressive viruses or bacterial infections, because they have an internal compromised immune system from these parasites, and vice versa. So where are we going to encounter, or if I was a bee out in the world, where would I encounter these viruses or bacteria or parasites, right? We should immediately think of the flower, right? We've got the foragers going out, different hives, different types of bees, different kinds of parasites, and other flying pollinators are all touching down in similar spaces or the exact same space, right? Nurse bees, right? That makes perfect sense, right? They're the most communicative with the pupae, with the larvae. They are the very first vectors that those little species, not species, but little babies get, right? The Varroa mite, right? Huge factor. The ability to move between bees is a serious problem. It can be a serious problem. They're just super well designed to live and grow with the bee. And little back history here on bees. So viruses became really serious for bees, as with many creatures on this planet, including humans, around the 1980s. This is likely corresponding with the introduction of various pesticides throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? Herbicides and fungicides being introduced in the 70s and 80s. We can see a direct correlation between those activities and the responses of our immune systems to defend against all kinds of things. Okay. And like I said, there's more than 20 viruses, but little is understood about many of them. So, okay, let's talk about the big beast. The Varroa mite, right? I always put an extra R in there. It's Varroa mite. Anywho, Varroa mites have been a parasite long-lived with the honeybee. It was moved out of its native habitat and introduced to other communities of bees, became a major problem in the 1980s here in the Western world. Okay, Varroa mites are hitchhikers. They are transmitting major vectors, right, for all kinds of things. They can live 2 to 3 months in the summer and 5 to 6 months in the winter. And we see that with a lot of insects, right? So under certain conditions, their life cycles are shorter. A lot of resources, they burn through that life cycle. And in the cooler months, they might have to go into hibernation and storage to facilitate their propagation, their offspring, right? Yeah, everything hibernates. I hibernate. I hope you hibernate. It's good for you. They can produce once they get into so they hop off of a little adult bee and they hop down into the larvae, like into the little cell, right? The female, because they're all females, save one, which she births first. So she hops in, she attaches to the larvae, she produces a male Varroa mite. Then she lays another female or a female and then another female every day. I think it's 4 or 5 days generally. Or maybe every day until she's exhausted. I don't know if she doesn't wear herself out, I guess. Anywho, so the females mate with the male. 6 to 7 days later, that is a mature female. Now, on average, only 1.2 viable mature, because once that pupa comes out as a living bee, if it's not matured, it does not survive. So on average, 1.2 viable mature female Varroa mites will evacuate with that bee. Okay. The pupae feed the growing Varroa mite. It's the protein that they are eating on. Okay. A lot of articles about that. You can do some research and confirm that information. It was originally believed that the Varroa mites were feasting on the humoral aspects of the bee, which is basically the blood, right? There's a new study out. I think it came out in 2018, but don't quote me because I don't have my dates in front of me. But I believe that this research is indicating that the Varroa mites are actually eating the protein from the fat body of the bee. And we can see here, these are hotspots. If they did a study, how much the percentage of Varroa mites locations, and you can see 60.58% of Varroa mites are found in this area here, which is the most easily accessible area for feeding on that fat body. Again, not a scientist, just translating what I am understanding. If I'm incorrect on any of these aspects, please contact me. I'd love to have a conversation. I'd love to read some materials. Always interested in learning more. And these things are all just being understood now. I mean, a lot of research is going into it, but that doesn't mean that we won't understand more or understand better and change all of this information in the future. Okay, so now that we know about these ugly creatures, let's talk about natural Varroa mite treatment management, right? I am really interested in this because I am opposed to chemical treatments, and bacterial treatments, and viral treatments. I believe that a strong immune system is the way to go. It's genetically, innate, passed down through genetic, expression to the next generation. We do it, animals do it, plants do it, bees do it, right? So let's take a little comparison before we get into some treatment methods. The comparison of what we might find in a beehive. So we have a little bee, mama's little queen bee, she lays her little egg. Little nurse bee comes in here, checks on the pupa or the larvae, excuse me, and it has a mite. Uh-oh, what's that mite gonna do? It's gonna hop down in there and it's gonna produce a little male Varroa mite. Well, all the work is being done, carries on as it would be. Caps are put onto this little pupae at this point, right? Larva, pupae. Oh, this is pupae. Yeah, this is pupae. Pre-pupae, this is pupae. Again, don't quote me on that if I misunderstand it. Please let me know. but I believe that is how it goes, larvae, pre-pupae, pupae. So now we've got capped in here. So the Varroa mites are free to feast on this little bee. So as they're feeding on it, they're compromising the immune system of this bee, right? Right off the bat. Yeah, we know that, okay? So we've got all these little Varroa mites growing, and then we have the emergence of the bee, right? On average, 1.2 of those bees will survive, or those Varroa mites will survive. Maybe the mother hitches her ride back out. Maybe she doesn't. Maybe they all mature and they all hop out. Maybe they don't. Maybe we don't get enough time in this this little brood cell to fully mature, right? And then life goes on, and that little bee continues to carry Varroa mites to the next flower, where it hops off or hops on, or where it can hop into another cell and attach, you know, start the whole process over again. So what can we do to interrupt this cycle? We can artificially swarm, right? Now I want to, before we go into this too much, I want to go back to this idea that co-evolution, right? So if we have a Varroa mite population with our bee populations, when is it that we have to decide that we need to control the Varroa mites, right? We might consider it when we have an infection, say foul brood. Foul brood is serious, easily transmissible bacterial infection. And I think, before I give away the big surprise, that we will find in nature that bees do this anyways. So we're going to take a little natural process and introduce it to our beehive. We're going to take the soiled hive components, sterilize them, and then we're going to take the entirety, no brood, because that's what the Varroa mites are eating on and living in. Take all of the living bees, make sure we have our queen, and we're going to introduce them into a sterile, however you like to say it, hive. Okay, so we have immediately interrupted that development of all the Varroa mites in the brood cells. Doesn't mean that we won't have hitchhikers still, but we will seriously limit the Varroa mite population right there, day one. We have basically sanitized the hive. Okay. So what are some clues that we might want to consider doing this? Foul brood. We see the bees entering into a lot of hygienic behavior. We see a lot of brood cells being interrupted. I have seen in some cases where people tell me that these are, the queen missed this, which might be the case, right? It might be the case that this is an emergent cell, that the bee is already evacuated. But it also could be an indication that the bees are cleaning potentially pathogenic or bacterially infected brood, right? So these cells may not necessarily mean bad or poor or declining production or misproduction by a queen. It could be an indication of a problem within the hive. Okay. So mite resistance, right? We understand that the bees have genetic predisposition, or can, to maintaining their environment against mites, right? So Russians are known to have this ability, but what is that? What is this ability that they're demonstrating? Is it grooming behavior? Is it a hygienic behavior? Or, check this out, found this ankle biting bees. There's a study, the Pennsylvania Queen Improvement Project has been working to develop. I'm trying to get more information on this and read more on this, but I found this wonderful graphic. We can thank the Lopres, I believe it's a French lab, and I'm going to definitely slaughter the name, but I've left some links in here. they're doing some research on these ankle biting bees, and they are literally eating the legs, biting the legs off of the Varroa mites, making them fall off in flight, fall off in the hive. But long story short, they're limiting their ability to navigate, jump off, or jump on, compromising the Varroa mites' ability to be successful. So when we're thinking about our genetics, this is a definite process we should, or a feature we should be considering. Okay. So I guess let's wrap this up with the natural beekeeping practices. We're going to look at good genetics. Good genetic behavior is in grooming, good hygiene, potentially, actually being offensive with the Varroa mite itself, right? So we're going to limit a lot of vector by limiting the access that the Varroa mite has to our bees by having good bee genetics, okay? So I'm going to talk about this a little bit because there's not just one way to skin a cat. And whether you agree with it, whether it falls in your ethical scope, if it falls outside your ethical scope, it doesn't matter. You still should be aware of what everyone is doing. You need to understand how their practices might affect your practices and vice versa, okay? A lot of our problems come from conflicts of activities and creation or destruction of habits and habitats and processes within species. Today we're talking about the bee, so we'll continue talking about the bee. By the way, this is a picture of my dad and my niece building fence. They did a great job, but I assure you they did not enjoy it. It was hot. Okay, so one method of treatment is called the brood break. And that is, it's kind of like an artificial swarm in a way, but you're not taking the hive away from the swarm, the physical hive. That might be an option if you don't have any problems like foul brood or other like the wing, the mutated wings. Anywho, so if you have a major outbreak of a disease or a parasite or bacteria, this may not be a good option for you. So basically, you're taking the queen and you're caging her and you're limiting her brood production, which is going to limit or cut the food source for the Varroa mite. Okay. People typically, if they do this, will do this in conjunction with other treatments. Artificial grooming stimulation. So I am not a fan of this because it is time consuming. I am a minimalist when it comes to interfering with the natural processes of most things. And I find that this would be something that I would not do. But if it's something that you would do, it might be a good experiment. It just might be something that you know, is part of your routine. That's fine. You remove the hive, you remove the bees from the hive, and you sprinkle them with powdered sugar, and it stimulates the grooming activity. Okay, so artificial grooming activity. I think artificial says it's everything you need to. It is probably not going to create a habit within the bee, but I guess maybe it could. Maybe it could be something that you do to encourage, although it probably wouldn't work, to be honest with you, because then they would require that sugar stimulant to activate the activity. So it may not be something that becomes a natural genetically passed down activity. Okay. Alcohol, soap, and wash. We'll probably talk about this a little bit later. Yes, the other day we were talking, when we first did this podcast, we had a lot of weather, and it interrupted the connection with the recording and the Zoom. So while we were in that conversation, Andrew from High Five Hives up in Idaho, he had discussed his experience with this, and I probably will let him elaborate a little bit more, but the gist of it is you take the bees, you wash them in alcohol or soap, and you shake it vigorously, and there's a couple other steps. It's actually quite time consuming, and there's a lot of steps involved. But then you do a count of the population to understand what your Varroa mite count is. A lot of, especially if you're a newbie beekeeper, you probably can't afford to lose that many bees. So that might be a factor for somebody who's got a huge outfit. Maybe they want to do that. I guess your circumstances would dictate if this would be something you would choose to do. Okay, sticky boards are pretty common. These are not invasive, but if you're going to be consistent with your with using this as a tool to indicate your mite population, you're going to have to be after this. You're going to have to make sure you follow up, make sure you do your counts. If you're going to do it on a regular basis to get a regular count all the time, every 3 days, right? Maybe do it once a week every 3 days. That's still, 20 minutes. You add that up over a season, that's going to be, several hours worth of work, right? So depends on your time constraints and your other activities, whether this might be a viable option. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Just leaving one in just to have an indication if there's debris falling, if you're finding other things like hive beetles, things like that. But you should already know that. I mean, honestly, if you do an inspection, you should have an understanding of what's in the hive. So basically, here's some numbers. So if you do a Varroa mite count, I guess a standard 2 deep length strip hive count should have 30 to 40 a day, right? So if you're finding that kind of population, apparently you need to mitigate, right? According to this philosophy here. Other rates are suggested as 1% is acceptable, 2 to 3% requires remedy, planning, or action, and 3% is indicative of losing a colony. Now, I can't speak to any of those numbers, but that is what the articles that I'm finding are indicating. Okay, this is cool. And we talked about this with Dr. Leo's, and we will go into this in another article, another conversation. What's size got to do with it? This is super cool. Apparently, if you can't imagine this, somebody decided that a larger hexagonal comb, right, would create a larger bee. The idea is that it would create a bigger bee that would be able to forage more, gather more pollen, and create more honey. Okay. Naturally occurring bees create smaller hexagons at 4.9 millimeters, while your commercial hexagons are 5.4 millimeters. There is a direct correlation between the production of Varroa mites and the size of the hexagonal comb. Now, maybe the reason why native bees have a smaller hexagon is that they already have a mechanism designed to prevent the production of Varroa mites. Maybe that limited cell space is limited because the bee only needs that much room to grow, giving room for Varroa mites to grow in there. I don't know. Makes a little sense. Okay, so mite trapping with brood drone. This is going back directly to the conversation we just had about brood size, or about cell size. So the different types of cells also determine what kind of bees are going to be grown in there, whether it's a drone bee or a worker bee. Okay. Drone bee cells are largely where we find Varroa mites growing. A couple of reasons. One, possibly on that cell size. Two, it takes 40 to 50 hours, right? Yeah, for a brood drone to grow versus the 15 to 13 hours. Or no, the cells are open. That's what it is. Sorry, I'm speaking. So cells are open longer when raising brood drone, giving more opportunity for the Varroa mites to get into the cell. Okay. So if you do this, I'm going to mark your calendar and remove the brood drone before the emergence of the Varroa mites. Put them in the freezer or dispose of that brood comb. Make sure you're disposing of it in a way in which you're actually destroying the Varroa mites, though, because if they're still eating and they can still escape, then there's a possibility they will just continue to propagate. I'm not saying that there's any evidence to that, but kind of makes sense. Okay, so while this is not a full sanitation of the hive, it could ease the stress on the hive, especially in times of dearth or drought or other times of scarcity. My other concern with using this technique is that you're interfering in the brood space, right? So every time that you change the temperature in the brood space, you are taking a chance that you're going to interfere in the maturation of the larvae. So just like an egg, right? You might interfere with that growth, and you will compromise that bee. So we will also talk more about that some other time. Okay. Oh, I had a slide out of order. I might fix that before I do the next one. Briefly, I'm not going to go into this. Soft chemicals that are used to treat Varroa mites include formic acid, oxalic acid, thymol, hops beta acids, flubalinate, yes. Hard chemicals are amitraz. Okay, all of these things have their goods and their bads, right? I don't use any of them. I don't condone any of them. I also don't begrudge anybody who uses them because everybody has their own philosophy and ideology, and I respect that. So formic acid is corrosive and very irritating. So you might consider how that's going to, if you're being surrounded by a corrosive and irritating chemical, you're going to be stressing out the bees, right? It does, however, penetrate the wax cappings, which is why people use it for in the fall. You have to use, all of these have to be used in a special circumstance. You have to know exactly what you're doing so you don't hurt yourself or the bees. Although I think that they all hurt the bees. Mite away quick strips is a common treatment for the formic acid. Oxalic acid, you can YouTube it or Google it, how to use it, but overdoses are harmful to the bees. Same thing with the formic acid. Thymol is found in Epigard. It is the essential oil of thyme plant. Now we all know, well, I don't know if we all know, but we do know that the thyme plant has a lot of really wonderful benefits, right? However, in this particular treatment, it is not as reliable as the mite away quick strips, so it has to be used regularly. And every time you do something like that, you're causing stress to the bees. So I don't like to stress my bees. It makes them irritable and less. I like to go over there without all my gear on and check on my bees. I don't want to be, running across the property to get away from bees. So same thing with the hops beta acids, which are potassium salts from hops plants. They also do not penetrate the wax cappings, which would require multiple treatments. These thymol and hops beta acids are used usually in conjunction with other treatments. In fact, most of these are, but this one here, flubalinate, is a pyrethroid. If you're familiar with pyrethrin or other pyrethrin-related chemicals, they definitely kill, 100%. So I don't know why we would use them with our bees. Sorry, I'm just like, I'll pass. Hard chemicals listed here as the amitraz. Now there are other treatments and other chemicals, I believe. I did not dig into them. This is again just a brief what people might be using in your neighborhood. Something to consider when you're catching wild hives, what they might have been exposed to, et cetera, et cetera. Just stuff to think about. Okay. This amitraz can be found to persist and is linked directly to bee mortality. So I'm not sure why we would use it. Okay. Here are a lot of the links that I used in reference for my research. There are more. If you would like to learn more about some of the things that I'm reading and researching, I have a Facebook group called Hive Happy Hour. If you want to check it out, I list a link in there about every day, stuff that I'm reading. I encourage you to share what you're learning and reading and just have a conversation. It's going to be fun. Let's do this. Let's have a conversation. This will also be posted later on at Stories in the Dirt, which is my my YouTube page, and you can see what happens in the conversation next, or Actually, we're going to do a conversation here at 6 o'clock. So this is a pre-recording practice, and I probably will post both just because. If I don't, then I hope you get to see this one, and I hope you get to see the other one as well. And I love the word and. So, and have a great day. Happy beekeeping, and I will see you guys